My name is Helena, I'm 78 years old, and I never thought I'd need to tell a story like this. I've always been a calm woman, accustomed to solitude and the simple routine of my seaside home. The waves were my companion. The wind coming through the cracks in the windows reminded me that I still breathed freedom. But that morning, at 3 a.m, everything changed. The sound of the door being forced open shattered the peace I'd cultivated for decades, and it wasn't a stranger who entered. It was my daughter-in-law Marissa with a fierce look in her eyes, and right behind her my own son Patrick. At first I thought it was a nightmare. Seeing them both in the doorway staring at me as if I were an enemy didn't seem real. Before I could react, Marissa shoved me violently to the floor. I felt my shoulder crack, my head thump, and a metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. Patrick stood there motionless, as if he didn't know me. She held papers and a pen in her hand and shouted that I needed to sign. I didn't understand right away, but I quickly realized they were fake documents. My house, my retirement, my name, all there to be stolen. What hurt most wasn't the blow, it was my son's gaze. He did nothing. He didn't scream, he didn't hold the woman, he didn't protect me. He just watched me as if numb. I tried to find some humanity in his eyes, but I only saw cowardice. Marissa, on the other hand, seemed consumed by hatred. She said that if I didn't sign, she'd put me in an institution, that no one would believe me, that they'd already made me look weak and incapable. Fear tightened my chest, but something inside me, in that instant, awakened. Yes, I signed. I signed because I didn't have the physical strength to resist, because the pain was unbearable, and because I thought I might die in that room. But as my hand trembled over the paper, I made a silent promise. That would be the last time I would remain silent. I had let too much go by in my life. I had swallowed humiliations. I had spent sleepless nights without reacting, but not this time. As soon as I could, I pressed the button hidden in the corner of the room, my SO system that few knew existed. A feature I had installed years before, just in case. That night would teach me why. When Marissa dropped me to the ground, she kicked me in the leg as if to leave a mark of possession. Patrick again did nothing. I trembled not only with pain but with a mixture of anger and sadness. Blood ran down my face and I thought, my own son, the one I held in my arms, the one I supported so many times, now looks at me as if I were a burden to be discarded. It was in that moment that shock gave way to clarity. I no longer had family in that house. I had enemies, and if I didn't act, they would erase me from their own history. The nearest neighbor, who had been receiving the SOS alerts, arrived minutes later and called the police. But Marissa and Patrick had already left, taking the signed documents by force. I lay there, being helped, my heart racing and my shoulder out of place. In the hospital, as I received stitches and listened to the doctors discuss my injuries, I began to wonder how this would be told. I knew they would say I was confused, that I'd made it all up, that my age would be used against me. It was there, on the stretcher, that I made my decision. I would not be disbelieved. The next morning, still aching all over, I requested copies of all the medical reports. I photographed bruises and recorded every detail. I wasn't going to leave room for misunderstandings. Marissa had always been cunning, knowing how to manipulate discourse, but I would have concrete proof. I called Celeste, my longtime friend, a retired judge who always told me, Helena, never give up the truth. She answered immediately and promised to help me. The second call was to Gloria, the leader of the community association, respected by all. I knew I couldn't fight. When I told them what happened, I heard silence on the other end of the line. It was a silence of indignation, not doubt. They both knew I would never make something like that up. Celeste advised me to keep everything to myself, not to give in to blackmail, and explained that those signatures would be worthless if I could prove coercion. Gloria, in turn, said that this wasn't just a family matter, but a community matter, that I needed to make it public. It was the first time someone had put into words what I already intuited. This wasn't just about heritage, but about dignity. I returned home with my body aching, but my mind stronger than ever. Every corner of the room still bore the memory of the invasion, the broken door, the scattered papers, the bloody stain on the floor. Looking at it made me nauseous, but it also strengthened me. It was as if the walls were saying, "You survived." I decided then and there that I wouldn't hide anything. I was past the age of keeping to save face. Marissa wanted to reduce me to a number in a bank account. Patrick preferred silence. I would be the only one to break this cycle. In the days that followed, I began to gather evidence. I printed bank statements showing suspicious withdrawals from my pension, some signed by me in situations that never existed. I recorded video statements recounting what had happened that morning, even though I was still swollen and bruised. I wanted there to be no doubt that this was my voice, my version, before anyone tried to distort it. As I did this, I cried. I cried not only for the physical pain, but for my son's betrayal. The truth is, I no longer recognized him. Celeste came by the house a few days later and brought a professional recorder. She suggested I recount everything in detail so it would be legally recorded. I sat in the living room chair, took a deep breath, and spoke like never before. Each word felt like a weight lifted from my chest. When I finished, Celeste looked at me and said, "Now you have your own weapon. They won't be able to keep this quiet." And I felt, for the first time since the attack, a spark of hope. The wound was still raw, but I was beginning to believe I could turn it into strength. Gloria, for her part, was already articulating something bigger. She told me she was calling a special meeting in the community hall. She said the community needed to hear the truth, that there was no point in fighting only with papers and in court. The public force of testimony would be decisive. I confess that, in that moment, I felt fear. I had never exposed myself like this, never shared my pain with dozens of people. But at the same time, I realized there was no going back. Either I spoke out, or I would continue to be erased. And I had already decided I would not be erased. The week of the meeting, my house practically became a preparation barracks. Celeste reviewed the documents, checking every detail as if she were back in court. Gloria spent hours on the phone confirming the presence of residents, asking them to bring witnesses, reinforcing how important it was. I, in turn, tried to mentally rehearse what I would say. Every time I closed my eyes, I returned to that early morning, the sound of the door breaking, the weight of the fall, the silence of my son. But instead of weakening me, the memory made me more convinced that I needed to speak out. The night before, I barely slept. My body still complained, but it was my mind that wouldn't stop. I thought about what they might say about me, that I was too old to remember the facts, that I'd lost it, that I was being manipulated. I already knew what their excuses would be because I'd spent my whole life listening to excuses. But there was a difference now. I had proof, I had witnesses, and I had my voice. Even if shaky, even if weak, it would be heard. When I entered the community hall, my heart raced. The chairs were full, familiar faces watching me with a mixture of curiosity and solidarity. Some whispered, others waved discreetly. I walked slowly to the front, holding a folder that seemed to weigh more than the world. But inside were not just papers, they contained my life, my rights, my truth, and I was ready to lay it all bare for anyone to see. Gloria opened the meeting. Her firm voice called for silence, and when she said my name, the room stopped. I stood on shaky legs and walked to the microphone. For a few seconds, I couldn't speak. I looked at the people, at the neighbors who so often saw me as just the lady from the big house on the beach, and swallowed hard, until I took a deep breath and blurted out. In the early hours of the 22nd, I was broken into in my own home. And it wasn't strangers, it was my son and his wife. A murmur ran through the room. I continued, now without pausing. I recounted every detail. The blows, the pen forced into my hand, the threats of hospitalization. I showed the marks on my body, lifted my sleeve so everyone could see the bruises. I took the papers out of the folder, placed them on the table, and then let everyone listen to the recording Celeste had prepared. My own voice narrated the scene of the attack with groans of pain. The silence that filled the room was deafening. When the recordings ended, I showed the medical reports and bank statements showing the illegal transfers. Each page was a blow to the farce Marissa had tried to construct. I saw the shock, disbelief, and anger in people's eyes at knowing this had happened so close to home. Then, as if it were the final blow, Ray, the association's security guard, played the footage from the external cameras showing the break-in. There was no longer any doubt. Marissa rose from her chair in the back. In a raised voice, she began shouting that it was all a misunderstanding, that I was being manipulated, that I was a confused old woman being used by others. Patrick, beside her, remained silent, head down, as always. But now, no silence could save them. The evidence was there, in front of everyone. And what struck me most was that no one believed her act. The entire community watched the farce crumble. The police officer's entrance into the room was the most memorable moment. They walked up to Marissa, informed her of the charges, and led her out. She was still screaming, saying it was unfair, that I didn't know what I was doing. But for the first time, I realized it wasn't me who was in despair. It was her. And seeing that gave me a sense of victory I can't describe. It wasn't about revenge, it was about justice, about finally being heard. Patrick remained in the living room, staring at the floor, unable to look at me. One could say he was embarrassed, but I only saw the omission. He didn't try to defend me that morning, nor did he try to stop what his wife did in the following days. His absence hurt more than Marissa's punches, and in that moment, seeing him still, I knew there was no turning back. The wound between us was already permanent. In the following days, the news spread throughout the city. Local newspapers reported the case, radio stations commented, neighbors repeated the story. I became the lady who stood up to her own son and daughter-in-law. And strange as it may seem, this restored something I had lost: respect. People who had previously barely greeted me on the street now stopped to offer support, not because they felt sorry for me, but because they saw courage in me. And I clung to that like someone clinging to a lifebuoy in a rough sea. Patrick came to me a few days later, knocking on my door with the same insistence as always. He begged us not to pursue the matter further, that it was better to resolve it quietly. He said I didn't understand the consequences, that he was ruined at work, that he could lose everything. Hearing that revolted me more than ever. He didn't say a word about what I'd suffered, didn't apologize, didn't acknowledge the pain he'd caused me. He only thought about himself. It was at that moment that I replied, with all the firmness I could muster within me. You already made your choice that morning, Patrick. Your silence was your decision. And now, my silence is over. I closed the door, even as he continued to speak. And I felt that for the first time, I had ended a cycle that had imprisoned me for years. From that moment on, I was no longer a mother trying to protect a child. I was a woman defending her dignity. With the help of Celeste and a lawyer she recommended, I began the legal process. I had never set foot in a courtroom as a principal party, and I confess I felt overwhelmed by so many formalities. But Sophia, the lawyer, spoke to me patiently. She said that every detail of my story, every medical exam, every bank statement was an important piece of information in dismantling the farce. She assured me that, despite the difficulties, I had a solid case. This gave me a peace of mind I hadn't felt in a long time. At the first hearing, when I sat before Patrick and Marissa, my hands were shaking, but it wasn't from fear. It was from indignation. Seeing my son sitting next to the woman who assaulted me, defending her with silence, was like reliving everything. When the judge asked me to recount what happened, my voice was firm. I didn't cry. I recounted every detail as if I were replaying a recording in my head. I felt the whole room was listening, and for the first time, I wasn't interrupted. Marissa tried to demoralize me, as always. She said I was confused, influenced by self-serving friends. She tried to play the victim, saying she only wanted to take care of me. But every word she said sounded weak compared to the evidence Sophia presented. When the records of illegal bank transfers surfaced, she lowered her eyes. And in that moment, I realized the mask had slipped. There was no longer any talk to support that lie. Patrick, for his part, remained silent. He didn't open his mouth either to deny or to admit. When the judge asked him if he confirmed he had witnessed the scene without taking action, he simply said, "I didn't know what to do." Those words cut me to the quick, because deep down I knew he knew. He just chose not to defend me. And it was at that moment that I understood he wasn't just passive, he was complicit. The newspapers began reporting on each hearing. Elderly woman faces daughter-in-law and son in fraud and assault case. So that was the headline. At first, I was startled. I wasn't used to seeing my face on television or in the newspaper, but I soon realized that this also protected me. The case had become too public to be hushed up. Marissa and Patrick couldn't silence me any longer. The more they tried to attack me, the more public opinion turned against them. Amidst all this, I received many letters and messages from women I didn't even know. Some said they'd also suffered abuse from their children. Others told stories of financial manipulation. Reading them made me understand that my struggle wasn't just mine. I represented many other stifled voices. Each word of support strengthened me, as if I'd gained an invisible army at my side. During the deposition, Sophia presented the forged signatures. The forensic examination confirmed they were mine, but made under duress. This was the definitive proof. I remember looking at Patrick at that moment, waiting for a reaction, but he just stood there, motionless, as if watching someone else fall. His coldness hurt more than any physical assault I'd ever experienced. Then I realized there was nothing left between us. At the third hearing, Marissa tried a last resort. She cried in front of the judge, saying she acted under pressure from debt, that she didn't know what she was doing, that she needed help. For a second, I saw some looks of pity in the courtroom. But when Sophia played the audio of the break-in with her voice threatening me, the farce ended. The tears gave way to silence, and the room understood who she really was. Patrick then tried to approach me in the hallway. He asked to speak privately, but I refused. There was no further conversation. He wanted me to drop the case, claiming that family matters are resolved at home. I looked him straight in the eye and replied, "Family matters are resolved when there's respect. What you did was choose the wrong side, and now I've chosen mine." I turned my back and walked away. Each step in the process made me feel stronger. Not because it was easy, but because I had nothing left to lose. The pain had already pierced me, and now what drove me was the certainty that I would never be silenced again. I often left hearings exhausted, crying alone in the car, but even then I kept repeating to myself, "You won't give up, Helena. Not now." The community welcomed me more and more. At the market, people came up to greet me, saying they were rooting for me. Some even offered financial help to cover the costs of the process, but I refused. I didn't want money, I wanted dignity. The support I needed wasn't in the bills, but in the echoing voices saying, "We believe in you." That was more valuable than any compensation. When the news of Marissa's pretrial detention broke, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I didn't celebrate, I didn't cheer. I just took a deep breath and thought, finally, someone saw what I went through. I knew there was still a long way to go. It was a sign that justice was moving. And for the first time in a long time, I slept a full night without a jolt. I agreed to visit Marissa in prison after much insistence from my lawyer. She said it would be important for the case to show that I wasn't afraid. I confess I trembled when I passed through the metal detector and heard the keys click shut behind me, but I took a deep breath and followed. When she entered the visiting room, dressed in her beige uniform, she was no longer the same arrogant woman who had invaded my home. She was haggard, her eyes sunken, but there was still arrogance in her posture. She tried to smile as if trying to maintain some control of the situation. I didn't smile back. I sat down and said immediately, "I'm not here to forgive you, Marissa. I'm here to tell you that you'll never have a place in my life again." She shifted in her chair, trying to maintain an air of superiority, but I sensed her discomfort. I continued, "You tried to silence me. You tried to steal what I built. You tried to destroy me, but you couldn't. And now, for the first time, you're going to listen to me without being able to interrupt me." She tried to argue, to say she was sorry, that she didn't know what she was doing, but I wouldn't let her. I explained every detail, every assault, every humiliation. I looked into her eyes and saw when she realized she no longer had any control over me. When I finished, I simply stood up and said, "You have no say in anything here anymore. Not in my life, not in my voice." And I left without looking back. That day I felt something different. It wasn't revenge. It was as if I'd returned to her the weight of everything she'd tried to place on me. I returned home feeling lighter, almost as if I'd closed a door that had been wide open for months. I understood that confronting Marissa in person wasn't about the lawsuit. It was about myself. It was my way of making it clear that I no longer lived in fear of her. Patrick, on the other hand, didn't give up trying to find me. He knocked on my door several times, sent messages through acquaintances. He said he was devastated, that he didn't want to lose his mother, that I was being too harsh. But I had already decided there was no more room for that unhealthy bond. I told him, "I'm still your biological mother, but the mother you knew died the day you chose to remain silent while I was beaten." He cried, insisted, tried to justify himself by saying he was scared, that he didn't know what to do. But that no longer moved me, because deep down I knew. True love isn't silence in the face of violence. True love isn't hiding behind cowardice. He made his choice, and I made mine. I didn't hate my son, but I also wouldn't allow him to occupy a space of trust within me again. Over time, I began to feel like my life no longer revolved around the process, but rather what came after it. I began attending therapy groups for seniors who had experienced domestic violence. At first, I entered shyly, unsure of what to say, but when I heard other stories as difficult as mine, I realized I wasn't alone. And when it was my turn to tell, I saw the same indignation in people's eyes as I had seen in the community hall. This gave me strength. It was during these meetings that Gloria suggested something bigger, transforming a space I had abandoned, an old property, into a place to help other women. The idea seemed too big for me, but the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. I didn't want to just survive my story. I wanted it to have a purpose. I wanted other women not to have to go through what I had gone through in silence. Organizing the space wasn't easy. My body still ached and the bureaucracy seemed endless. But little by little, I saw the rooms being cleaned, the furniture being donated, the painting taking on new life. When we set the first table in the main hall, I felt tears well up. That place, once abandoned, would now be a refuge. I named it Life Workshop because that was what I wanted. To rebuild lives that had been shattered. The opening day was emotional. Several women I'd met in therapy groups were there. Some cried just seeing the space, others hugged me as if I were family. When I took the microphone to speak, my hands were shaking, but my heart was at peace. I said, "For so long they've tried to silence me. Today, this space exists to ensure that none of us need live in silence anymore." The applause I received at that moment was the most beautiful victory of my life. The process was still ongoing, but it was no longer the center of my existence. I had found something greater. Every workshop, every conversation circle, every woman who walked through the door with fear and left with hope reminded me that my pain had become strength. I didn't just recover my heritage, I recovered my identity. When I got home that night, I sat on the porch and listened to the sound of the waves. For the first time in a long time, that sound didn't feel empty. It was as if the sea was telling me I had won. Not because I had destroyed those who tried to silence me, but because I had rebuilt myself after them. As the weeks passed, the Oficina da Vida began to take shape. At first it was just small gatherings, but soon the first lectures, craft workshops, financial literacy classes, and even reading circles began. Each activity seemed to restore a part of the women's selves that had been stolen by years of silence. I saw in their eyes the same sparkle that was beginning to return to mine. One of the first women I sought to help was Teresa, 62. She arrived with her face scarred from years of submission to her husband, saying she didn't have the courage to leave the house without permission. I remembered so much of myself that morning when I felt like I had no way out. Patiently, I listened to every detail and realized that, just by being there, she had already taken a huge step. It was at that moment that I understood that the workshop was not just a physical space, but a turning point for many stories. With each new story, I felt my own heart heal. It was as if each shared pain was also a form of healing. Often I would come home exhausted, but as I lay in bed, I would remember the words of gratitude I'd heard throughout the day. This made me feel that, despite everything I'd lost, I had gained something much greater: relevance. My life, which had previously seemed to be heading towards silence, now echoed in the lives of others. The court case continued in parallel. Hearings piled up and the press wouldn't let the case cool. In some interviews, I was asked to speak about my experience. I never imagined making public statements, but I realized my voice had the power to inspire other women to report abuse. Each time I told my story, it wasn't just about me. It was about all those who never had the chance to be heard. Patrick kept trying to reach out to me. He even sent letters asking for forgiveness, but they didn't really acknowledge what he'd done. He always said he didn't know how to act or that he was lost. Never a simple phrase like, "I messed up." This showed me he still hadn't grasped the weight of his omission. I tore up some of the letters, kept others, but I never responded. Silence was now mine. Not as submission, but as a choice. With Marisa, the situation was different. She remained in pre-trial detention until her trial, and during that time, I heard rumors that she was trying to manipulate other inmates with the same tricks she used outside. That confirmed to me that she wouldn't change. I didn't visit her again after the first time. I felt I had said everything that needed to be said. My cycle with her was over. The trial was a watershed moment. When the sentence was handed down, confirming the conviction for fraud and assault, I cried. Not because I wanted to see anyone behind bars, but because it represented the end of a battle that seemed endless. Justice had officially recognized what I had experienced. And for the first time, it wasn't just my word against theirs. It was a document, a decision that no one could erase. After that, I allowed myself to breathe. I began walking along the beach early in the morning, feeling the wind on my face. The waves, which had previously reminded me of loneliness, now brought me a sense of rebirth. It was as if each step in the sand was a reminder that I still had a future, even at 78, and that future would not be lived in silence. The impact of the case led other communities to invite me to speak. I went to schools, associations, and churches. I told my story without embellishment, just as it happened. I always said, no matter the age, a woman's voice should never be silenced. Each talk was difficult because reopening memories hurt, but seeing people moved, writing down every word, I realized that pain transformed into a lesson had value. Adio. The Oficina, we began organizing a regular legal support group with volunteers offering free counseling. Seeing women leave with papers in their hands and hope in their eyes moved me. I remembered myself, leaving the hospital with medical reports and a heart full of doubts. Now, I was helping to shorten that path for others. Little by little, the city began to see me not as a victim, but as a role model. It wasn't something I sought, but something I built with each step I took. Some people said I was strong, but I always said no. I simply had no choice. The strength came because if I didn't fight back, I would be dead inside. And deep down, I believe we all have that strength, even when we think we don't. One night, as I closed the workshop after a busy day, I found myself alone in the empty room. I looked at the chairs, the freshly painted walls, and felt a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. I placed my hand on my chest and thought it was worth it, because despite the scars that will never fade, I had transformed my pain into a legacy, and nothing and no one could take that away from me. As the workshop grew, I received an unexpected invitation to speak at a state conference on seniors' rights. At first, I hesitated. I thought it was too big for me, a woman who, until recently, was afraid to raise her voice in her own home. But Gloria insisted, "Helena, your story isn't just yours anymore. It belongs to everyone who needs to hear that resistance is possible." I accepted, even though my heart was racing just thinking about taking the stage. The auditorium was packed. When my name was announced, my legs felt like cotton, but as I held the microphone, I felt the same poise I'd found in the community hall months earlier. I recounted my journey from the invasion to the creation of the workshop. I saw people taking notes, others crying quietly, and I realized that every detail resonated deeply with those listening. When I finished, I received a standing ovation. I never imagined experiencing something like this at my age. This visibility brought new challenges. Some journalists tried to sensationalize my story, turning my pain into a spectacle. I had to learn to set boundaries, to say no when I felt they were just looking for ratings. It wasn't easy, because the temptation to remain silent and avoid conflict still haunted me. But I remembered where I came from. Imposed silence, and each no I said, was also a way of maintaining my dignity. One of the most memorable moments happened when a young woman, just 20 years old, approached me after a lecture. She said she was suffering psychological abuse from her boyfriend and didn't have the courage to break up. After hearing my story, she said she decided to seek help. When I hugged her, I felt my struggle had spanned generations. It wasn't just about older women, it was about all women who, at some point, have felt trapped. Meanwhile, Patrick was trying to rebuild his life away. From the city, I learned from neighbors that he had permanently lost his job and that Marissa was still incarcerated. I felt no satisfaction in this. I simply acknowledged that their choices had led to this end. Some nights, I still cried alone, thinking about the son I'd lost, but I soon remembered that I wasn't the one who pushed him away. He was the one who chose, and this knowledge gave me peace to move on without guilt. Changes also came within me. I discovered pleasures I hadn't previously allowed myself. I started cooking new recipes, planting flowers in the garden, listening to old songs loudly, without fear of disturbing anyone. Simple things, but they represented my regaining of freedom. I felt like I was in control of my time again, in control of myself. At the workshop, we began working with stories of overcoming adversity. Each woman who passed by was encouraged to write or record her story. We created a mural with photos, quotes, and memories. Seeing everything displayed, realized we weren't just helping people overcome problems. We were building memories, a collective record of resilience, and that moved me deeply. I also received support from local authorities, who began allocating resources to the project. For the first time, I felt like the government was listening. It was strange to think that I had to be abused and exposed to be heard. But instead of rebelling, I turned this reflection into fuel. I used every opportunity to demand change, to remind people that many other elderly women still lived in silence. One day, I was called to speak at a local school. I walked into a room full of teenagers and, for a moment, I thought they wouldn't take me seriously. But when I began to tell my story, I saw silence take over. Some looked at me in fear, others attentive. At the end, a girl raised her hand and said, "I'll take better care of my grandmother after listening to you." That's when I realized the significance of it all. Despite so many achievements, memories of the assault still returned in my dreams. I woke up sweaty, with my heart racing, hearing the sound of the door breaking in my head. Therapy helped me cope, but I understood that some scars don't disappear. What changes is the meaning we give them. Before, they were marks of pain. Now, they were marks of survival. In one of these sessions, my therapist said something I've never forgotten. "Helena, you transformed silence into speech and speech into legacy." That echoed in my mind. For the first time, I saw my story not just as pain overcome, but as a living example. I didn't want to be anyone's heroine, but if my journey helped other women rise up, then it was worth it. To mark the 1-year anniversary of the workshop's creation, we held a celebration. The hall was filled with women, children, young people, and even men who supported the cause. When I lit the first candle on the makeshift cake, I cried. Not because I felt sadness, but because I realized that even after so many attempts to silence me, I was there, surrounded by strong voices. It was the anniversary not of a physical space, but of my own reconstruction. With the success of the workshop, I began to be invited for interviews on radio stations and even regional television programs. At first, the idea of sitting in front of a camera made me nervous, but I realized it was an opportunity to reach even more people. Whenever people asked how I managed to endure it all, I would answer, honestly, it wasn't courage at first, it was necessity. When you have no choice, You find strength where you didn't even know it existed. These simple words resonated. I received messages from women in other cities and even other states. Some said they were starting community movements inspired by the workshop. Others asked me for advice, and I always replied that there was no magic formula, only the decision to no longer accept violence as normal. This showed me that my struggle had gone beyond the confines of my city. One of the most moving experiences was when I participated in a statewide meeting on elder abuse. I entered a huge auditorium filled with health professionals, lawyers, and family members. I wasn't a technician. I didn't bring statistics. I brought my story, and I saw how important it was. As I spoke, many people became emotional, and at the end, a white-haired woman hugged me, crying, saying, "I've experienced the same thing as you, but I never had the courage to tell you." It was on that day that I realized my life had taken a turn I never imagined. I was no longer just an elderly woman who had survived an assault. I had become a role model for other women. This gave me a sense of pride I can't explain, but also a huge sense of responsibility. I needed to be constantly vigilant so my story wouldn't be misused. The national press began to seek me out. Some articles told my story respectfully. Others tried to turn it all into a spectacle. I learned to choose who to talk to. I didn't want to be exploited. I wanted to be useful. And little by little, I grew stronger in front of the cameras, learning to say exactly what needed to be said, that silence kills, and that speaking out is the first step to survival. Amid this exposure, my personal routine also changed. People who had previously barely greeted me now treated me with admiration. Some even went so far as to call me a heroine. I always replied that I wasn't a heroine, just someone who grew tired of being afraid. This sincerity brought me closer to people because it showed that anyone could resist, just like me. Within the workshop, we began to welcome women from other cities. Some traveled hours to participate in our conversation circles. This deeply moved me. It was a sign that what we had built there had become a beacon. Many said they felt at home, that they finally had a place where they could speak without being judged. This welcoming environment was, for me, the greatest victory. I remember one afternoon in particular when a woman named Olivia shared that her children had taken her retirement and left her alone. As she spoke, I relived my own story. In the end, she said, "If it weren't for this space, I would have given up." Hearing that brought me to tears. It was living proof that my pain had been transformed into something life-saving. Despite my achievements, I still faced internal challenges. Some nights, the fear returned in the form of nightmares. I would wake to the sound of the door being forced open, the weight of the pen forced into my hand. But instead of letting it get me down, I would take a deep breath and remind myself, "You're no longer that knight, Helena. You won." This reminder was painful, but it also reaffirmed my victory. Patrick, even from a distance, remained a shadow in my heart. Not out of love or longing, but out of a disappointment that never disappeared. I learned to live without him, but sometimes I wondered if he would ever understand the weight of what he had done. I no longer hoped for reconciliation, but I wished he would at least be aware. The difference was that now that thought no longer paralyzed me. It was just a distant memory, no longer dictating my life. On the other hand, I forged strong bonds with women who became like family to me. Celeste and Gloria remained by my side, steadfast as ever, and other companions emerged. I discovered that family isn't just blood. Family is who supports you when you're down, who holds your hand when everyone else turns their back. And this new family was what kept me going. Looking back, I realize how much I've changed. Before, I was just a lady living alone by the sea, invisible to many. Today, I'm someone who's learned to transform pain into struggle, silence into voice. I have no illusions that everything will be easy from now on. But I know that whatever happens, I'll never be silenced again. And this certainty, for me, is the greatest. The workshop grew so much that we began to need regular volunteers. Young people from the community volunteered to help with activities, and even freelance professionals began donating their time and expertise. Doctors came to give health lectures, lawyers offered legal advice, and psychologists provided free consultations. I was moved to see how something that had been born from my own pain had now become an entire support network. We also began recording the stories of each woman. We helped. Some wrote letters, others left audio or video recordings. We kept everything in an archive because I believed it was important to preserve the memory of each struggle. I always said, if they tried to erase our voices for so long, now we will record them forever. This collection became a collective heritage, demonstrating that silence would never again have a place there. One of the most special moments was when we received a visit from university students from out of town. They came to research community initiatives and were impressed by the strength of the workshop. They asked to record interviews with me and other women. At the end, they said they would return to present academic papers based on what they saw there. I felt immense pride because I realized that our struggle was inspiring not only women, but also future generations of professionals. I also started receiving invitations to speak outside the state. I went to a neighboring capital, flew for the first time in many years, and stood on a stage larger than I could have imagined. I was nervous, but when I saw hundreds of people listening to me in silence, I understood that the size of the audience didn't matter. What mattered was the truth I carried, and that truth had power. On these trips, I met incredible women who were also fighting against abuse and injustice. Some already had projects similar to the workshop, others were just starting out. Sharing experiences with them showed me that I was part of something bigger, a movement that knew no borders. It was as if each woman were a flame, and together we formed a bonfire that no one could extinguish. Despite the recognition, I never stopped appreciating the little moments. I liked arriving early at the workshop, making coffee, opening the windows and smelling the salty air wafting from the sea. It was in these simple moments that I remembered who I was, a woman who chose not to remain silent. Everything else was a consequence of that choice. There was also resistance. Some people in town said I was exposing my family too much, that such matters should be handled at home. At first, this criticism shook me. But then I realized that this was precisely the mindset that kept so many women trapped in silence, and I responded firmly. It was silence that almost killed me. Speaking out is what saved me. Patrick remained distant, and I no longer had any expectations. Sometimes I wondered if he would ever understand the full extent of his choice that morning. But I no longer expected anything. My life was no longer tied to his decisions, and that in itself was liberating. With Marissa, the situation was final. Her conviction was upheld, and she served her sentence. I never saw her again, nor did I want to. For me, that chapter was closed. There was no hatred, only indifference. I no longer carried her weight with me. What remained was the memory of the night they almost silenced me, but which ended up becoming the beginning of my new life. One day, I received a surprise tribute at the community association. They set up a panel with photos of me alongside so many other women who had attended the workshop. When I saw it, I cried, not because I wanted recognition, but because I realized I was no longer alone. My story had intertwined with that of so many others, and together we had created something much bigger than ourselves. This tribute made me think about the future. I was no longer young, and I knew my days wouldn't be endless, but I wanted to leave something that would last. So I started talking with Celeste and Gloria about how to structure the workshop so it would continue even after I was gone. They agreed to take on larger roles, and together we began planning for its continuation. It was at that moment that I understood clearly that my legacy wasn't just to resist. My legacy was to ensure that others would continue to resist after me. This certainty gave me a peace of mind I'd never felt before, because I realized that even when my voice was silenced for good, it would continue to echo through the women I helped lift up. The preparation for leaving the structured workshop was intense. We held weekly meetings, created simple bylaws, and defined roles for each volunteer. I wanted the space to be independent of me, to survive even when I could no longer be present. Seeing so many committed people moved me. It was like planting a tree and finally seeing that the roots were strong enough to sustain the future. Meanwhile, I continued attending lectures and meetings. Increasingly, I realized that my story wasn't just about violence, but about transformation. I always said, I'm no longer the same woman I was that morning. Today, I'm proof that no matter your age, it's always possible to start over. These words became almost a motto, repeated by many women who attended the workshop. One afternoon, I received a visit from an out-of-state reporter. She wanted to do an in-depth story, not about the crime, but about what happened afterward. I accepted. When the report aired, showing not only my story but also the impact of the oficina on the lives of so many women, I received dozens of letters. Some came from places I didn't even know where. That's when I realized my legacy had already transcended borders. Despite all this expansion, I never stopped missing my simple life. Coming home after a busy day and sitting on the porch looking at the sea was the moment that brought me the most peace. The sea, which had once witnessed my pain, now witnessed my victory. I no longer saw it as a threat, but as a faithful companion, ever present, ever constant. One day, a young journalist asked me if I regretted anything. I thought for a few seconds before answering. I said that if I could go back, I would have spoken sooner, I would have defended myself sooner. But I added, everything happens in its own time, and I needed that night to understand that my voice was worth more than any silence. Her expression showed that those words had left a mark on her. The therapy groups I attended also changed. Before, I spoke as someone still healing. Now, I spoke as someone who had already overcome. I noticed the difference when other women began seeking me out, not only to hear my story, but also to ask for advice. I didn't see myself as a counselor. I simply shared my experience. But knowing that my words were helping others rise gave me a sense of mission. Little by little, the city also changed its view of me. I was no longer just the lady of the scandal, but rather the lady of the workshop. This seemingly simple title change meant a lot. It signaled that my identity was no longer tied to the crime I suffered, but to the strength I built after it. Some distant family members tried to reconnect, claiming they'd been by my side from the beginning. But I knew who was truly there for me and who had merely watched from afar. I learned not room for relationships that didn't bring me peace. My life, at this point, needed tranquility, not more wounds. And this, for me, was also a lesson in overcoming. In one of my last lectures, a girl of about 15 asked me how I managed to live without anger. I replied that anger had consumed me in the past, but that if I remained trapped in it, I wouldn't have achieved anything. I told her that true victory wasn't punishing those who hurt me, but living free from the burden they tried to place on me. I saw a silent understanding in her eyes, and it moved me. The workshop's 2-year anniversary was even bigger than the first. We held a large conversation circle with women from various cities. When I looked around, I saw so many different stories united by the same purpose. And I thought, none of this would exist if I had remained silent. This thought made me cry silently, but this time they were tears of gratitude. That same night, when I got home, I sat on the porch again, my eyes closed. I felt the wind on my face and heard the sea. I thought about everything I'd been through, every fall, every tear, every closed door, and I realized that, despite everything, I was alive, standing tall and at peace. This peace was the strongest proof that no one had been able to defeat me. In that moment, I understood that overcoming wasn't just surviving violence, but finding meaning in its aftermath, turning a stifled scream into an echo that reached so many. I, who had nearly been erased, was now a living reminder that there's always a way back to yourself. Months later, I received an invitation to speak at a national human rights conference. It was the first time I'd traveled so far to tell my story. When I took the stage in front of hundreds of people, I felt my hands tremble, just like at my first community meeting. But as I began to speak, I realized my voice no longer held fear. It carried conviction. I told it all from beginning to end and concluded by saying, I'm proof that it's never too late to stand up. At the end of the talk, many people came up to hug me. One woman told me she had decided to report her own brother after hearing my talk. Another said she was going to start a project similar to the workshop in her city. I realized that my story had become a tool for real change. It wasn't just my life that had been transformed, but the lives of many others as well. When I returned home, I sat on the porch as usual. The sea was calm, reflecting the moon. I thought about Patrick, about Marisa, about everything that had happened. There was no more pain, just a cold distance. They were part of my past, but they no longer held power over my present. And this sense of freedom was the greatest gift I could receive in my old age. The workshop continued to grow. We had already formed a network with other cities and even received support from larger organizations. I knew that even when I was no longer here, that space would continue. This gave me an indescribable peace. My legacy was no longer just mine, it was collective. One day, Gloria said to me, "Helena, you didn't just save your own life, you saved many others." I was silent for a few seconds, tears in my eyes. Not because I wanted recognition, but because those words summed up everything I had been searching for since that early morning, to transform pain into life. On the streets, people still greeted me respectfully. Some called me an inspiration, others just smiled from afar. I always responded the same way. I'm not an inspiration, I'm just someone who decided to no longer accept silence. And I repeated this because I wanted everyone to know that anyone could do the same. Little by little, I learned to be proud of my scars. They were there, on my body and soul, but they were no longer open wounds. They were marks of survival. When I looked in the mirror, I saw not just a 78-year-old woman. I saw a woman who had been tested to the limit, and yet, even so, had not broken. I began writing my stories in a notebook, not to publish, but to record my journey in my own words. I felt it was important to leave something written, so that those who came after could understand that the struggle neither began nor ended with me. Each page filled was like a full stop on another piece of pain. On the 3rd anniversary of the workshop, we held an even larger celebration. People came from various regions and the hall was packed. When I was called to speak, I looked around and saw so many strong women, so many stories that had blossomed from mine. I took the microphone and said, "What began as an attempt to silence myself has become a chorus, and this chorus will never be silenced again." They gave a standing ovation and I cried, embraced by so many hands that had previously been alone. That night, as I returned home, I realized that life had given me a second chance, not a chance to forget, but to rebuild. I understood that true victory lay not only in the justice of the courts, but in the justice I had achieved within myself, to live without fear, without silence, without submission. Today, when I walk along the beach, I feel the sand beneath my feet and the wind on my face, and I think I survived the worst. And surviving is no small feat. To survive is to win. Because when they tried to silence me, they couldn't. My voice echoed, my story spread, and my legacy lives on. And so I carry on, knowing that even when I'm longer here, what I built will remain. Because it wasn't just my life that changed that morning. It was the fate of many other women who, like me, discovered that it's never too late to start over.